Hi, I'm Dave Rice, and it's Sunday afternoon. I'm sitting in my house all by myself this afternoon, and I just thought that I would share a little word of testimony with you. Our pastor this morning spoke from Mark chapter 14, and he spoke of the selfishness of Judas, and he spoke of the arrogance of Peter at the moment when Peter looked up at him in front of all the other guys and was playing big shot and saying, even if all these other guys around me should uh, leave you, I never will. And he talked about how they went in the garden and they all fell asleep while Jesus was suffering through this pre-crucifixion torture that he was going through. And he went off a little bit and began to speak about this special anointing that comes to Christians only through pain and suffering through hard times. And he spoke of the fact that you can go and get blessed at a meeting in church or a conference. You can get blessed about anywhere. You can get blessed when somebody lays hands on you, and there's a lot of different kinds of blessings, but there is an anointing, a real relationship with Jesus Christ that only comes through suffering and through pain and through difficult times. And I just thought that I would share with you my little story about pain and suffering. Just a short testimony. It's a story that would take a 3-volume book to probably tell completely. But I think I can do it here in just a few minutes. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to tell you about my experience with this pain-induced anointing. There was a time in my life when I was a bad guy. Okay, I know you don't think I could ever have been a bad guy, but I was. And there was a time when I found myself out in the wonderful state of California, and I was running from the law, and I was running from myself, and I was running from God. And somehow I had decided that I was just going to start life over out there. And actually, I wasn't doing bad. I was eating well. I was making good money. I really had started over. And I have since been diagnosed as manic depressive. When the VA psychiatrist told me I was manic depressive or bipolar, I sort of laughed at him because I didn't understand what it was. But when I came home, I began to look up stories written by people who had suffered with the same thing, and suddenly I identified with it, and it explained a lot of things in my life that had happened that were unpleasant. And one of those things was the fact that faced with real problems, I had run. And my answer was to start over again. I had run in tears, and having escaped, I was so full of joy and enthusiasm, and I made it. I made it. But there came a day when God began to talk to me. God began to speak to me. I had been an ordained pastor. I had been to Baptist schools. I had been ordained in the First Baptist Church in West Palm Beach. I had committed my life to be a missionary on the foreign field. And then my whole life had just collapsed through a lot of things that I don't have time to talk about here. But there I was in California, a long ways from Florida, and I was wanted, and I couldn't contact my family, and I couldn't contact anybody who had anything to do with my prior life. And suddenly it got to me. And I remember one night that I just laid on my bed and I wept. And this time it wasn't bipolar. It wasn't that kind of depression. It was weeping before the Lord. And I remember my words because I have repeated that prayer over and over and over again throughout my life. And that prayer was this: oh God, whatever it takes to get me from what I am and where I am to what and where you want me to be, you do it. I don't care what it is, you do it. You get me from where I am and what I am to where and what you want me to be. Just do it. Well, no one was really looking for me out there, but the very next day, through a set of strange circumstances, I ended up arrested. And they found out about my past, and they stuck me on a van and sent me back to Florida, and I saw a judge, and I ended up in the Florida State prison system. Well, when I got to prison, it was an amazing thing because on the first day there, one of the things I was required to do was meet with the chaplain. And the chaplain was this wonderful guy. He had been a captain in the Green Beret in Vietnam. Marvelous man. And now he was with the Mennonite Church, which is a pacifist group. Strange move. And he was a pastor in the Mennonite Church, and he was the full-time chaplain at this South Florida prison. And he listened to my story. And after I finished telling him my story and how I got there, he said, well, I need a chaplain's assistant. You're the perfect guy. Show up tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, right after breakfast, and I'll show you what to do. And so the next morning, I showed up at the chapel, and he called me in, and he talked to me a while, and then he walked me over to the chapel library, which was a mess, just books, several thousand books, just stuffed on shelves in no particular order. And he said, you've got an education, you know how to do this. I want you to start straightening this up and helping me with a card catalog and start organizing these books. He said, but your real job is to read 2 Christian books of your choice every week and write book reports on them, and give me book reports on 2 Christian books every week. I'm not sure that when I left 6 months later, and yeah, I was only there 6 months, so you can't call that hard time. But when I left 6 months later, the library didn't look much better than it did the day I showed up. Maybe a little, but not much. But I had read many, many books. And so I had begun to develop a life with Jesus through him, through the chapel, and through these Christian books. When I got out, I went home to my parents' house in the middle of the state. And one of the first people I met at church was a fellow named Bill Townsend. Now, you might know and have heard of his dad, Cam Townsend. Cam Townsend started Wycliffe Bible Translators. And after a few weeks, Bill announced that he thought that I should go with him and spend the summer in Peru in the jungle. And I said, I don't have any money. And he said, well, come with me. And he stuck me in his little pickup truck, and we drove up to Waxhaw, North Carolina, and met with his mother, Aunt Elaine, as everybody called her. And Aunt Elaine looked at me and said, well, if Bill thinks you should go, I think you should go. And she made a couple of phone calls, raised about $6,000 in 15 minutes, and I was on my way to Peru. And I went there as a missionary, but of course, at the time, I did not speak any Spanish. And that didn't make much difference because we went to an Indian village way out in the jungle, and they didn't speak Spanish either. And I certainly did not speak Kandoshi. No idea of the language. And so I'm not certain that I did much mission work there, but God used me. And God used that situation to teach me. And since then, I haven't been perfect. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've had to deal with a lot of things. But God has used me in ways that without that kind of pain, without that kind of face-to-face contact with Him, I never could have made. And I've been a missionary in Mexico. I spent nearly a decade in Venezuela. God used me to start a Bible college, which now has campuses, I assume, still in Venezuela, though maybe not, but also in Guyana and in Brazil, that's still turning out young preacher boys. And God has used me in so many ways to write a book recently, many things, but there is a depth of my relationship with God that came through pain. And I will tell you this, that I am no longer afraid of pain or suffering. And you as a Christian don't need to be afraid of pain or suffering either. Because if you're a Christian and you seek God and go through God and get close to Him and draw close to Him in the midst of your deepest pain, you will come out the other side a better person. The night I laid on my bed and cried, the night I prayed, God, whatever it takes to get me from what I am and where I am to what and where you want me to be, do it. That night I had no way of knowing that I would end up in a prison with a Christian chaplain who would assign me the job of reading 2 Christian books a week and writing book reports. I had no idea that I would end up in Peru doing mission work, or in Mexico, or in Venezuela, or anywhere else. I didn't know that, but I knew in the depths of my heart that I was hurting and I was suffering and I couldn't take it anymore. And I had to give it to God. And whatever the situation is in your life right now, whatever it is, you just give it to God. And I would suggest that you use similar words, not my words necessarily, but the similar thought. Just give it to God. God, whatever it takes to get me from what I am and where I am to what and where you want me to be, you just do that. Can you do that for me? Do that for God. Do that for yourself. Do that for your family. And God will honor it. I promise.